Okay, today is part one of a series on tzitzis, which came up really as a question of how we should give hashgacha on tzitzis. There are tzitzis, the cloths and the strings, etc., that are made with hashgacha, and how would we do that if it came up? So that's what this series is based on, those kind of questions of what would it take to give hashgacha. Of course, it's relevant to, so to speak, average people who want to wear tzitzis also, but really that's where it came from. So today we're going to talk about the size that the cloth has to be, the beged has to be, to have tzitzis in it. So we're going to talk about three different parts: the length, the width, and the hole, where the neck goes. So as far let's start with the length. The Gemara says that you only chayiv in tzitzis if it's a beged that's shakatim eskasa b'rosh of rubai, that a child could cover himself rosh of rubai. Because in order to be, the pasuk says you have to put tzitzis on ksuschash at the chasaboy, something that you could cover you, and therefore, so we say it has to be big enough to cover you. So the Gemara says it has to be for a cotton. There's different opinions in the poskim about how old that child is. When we say a child, there's all different types of children. We'll see some more about this a little later. Some say 5 years old, 6 or 7 years old. The Mishnah Berurah follows the opinion who says that it has to be as for a 9-year-old child. Now, before we talk about what that means to cover a 9-year-old child, there's a shaila in the poskim. What does it mean when the Gemara says it has to be shakatim eskasabei roishay v'rubai, his head, roishay, and his body, most of his body? Does it mean is roishay v'ru means is take his whole body and head included, and it has to be most of that, or does it mean the whole head, roishay, plus the majority of the rest of his body? Now, what you would think at first, if it says roishay v'rubai, means it's his head plus his body. Because if it meant just the body including the head, why would it have to say the roishay part of it? So the Chazon Ish asked this question, like what would be the tzad that the head is? If it means his body including his head, why say head altogether? So he says the pshat is, because I want to tell you which side to count from. You go roishay v'rubai from the head side rather than from the foot side, which l'chayra makes a difference to how wide it has to be, because the body at the head side is wider than at the foot side. Okay, anyhow, so this is a question in the poskim. So for example, let's say we would say that a child is 48 inches tall, let's say, and 8 inches of that is his head. So if you say roishay v'rubai means most of the person, including his head, then that means it's a little more than 24 inches. He's 48 inches tall, so the majority of that is 24 inches. But the second shot that would say is, well, Roshah is 8 inches, so the rest of his body is another 40 inches, so we need most of 40 inches, meaning a little more than 20 inches, plus 8 inches, so we end up being about 28 inches, as opposed to the first one would have been only 24 inches. To do in the poskim about this, I'm not going to go through the details. The Radvaz ends up that he thinks it's the most body plus the head. The Artz Chaim, which is a Malbim, has a lot to say about Hilchas Tzitzis. Artz Chaim is a halacha sefer from the Malbim. He says, and he has rayas to that. Chazon Ish is not so convinced. Chazon Ish thinks it's more probably the other way, that just most of the body altogether. And there's a complicated raya from the Trumas edition, from something that he says in Hilchos Sukkah, that roishay v'rubai means most of the body, including the head. I'm not going to go into the detail of that raya from the Trumas edition. It's a little bit of a complicated raya. So let's just leave it at this point as there's different ways. Some people would say roishay v'ru means the head, the most of the body, which includes the head, or it means the whole head plus most of the rest of the body. Okay, so now we know we need roishay v'rubai of a child of the height of a 9-year-old child, and we have two opinions what it is. Okay, seems straightforward enough. Okay, it seems that should be easy enough. Except we have a problem when we start to look at how big 9-year-old children are, and that's because there are people. There is a study that was done, international records of people, how tall they are in different countries at different ages. Loads and loads of record about this thing over 35 years that it was. And guess what? It shows that the difference between the 9-year-olds in the, so to speak, in the country with the shortest boys and the country with the tallest boys is huge. The one with the shortest is Rwanda, and the one with the tallest was in French Polynesia. and there was more than 11 inches of difference between the height of them. Okay, so which 9-year-old do we want? Do you want the one from Rwanda or French Polynesia or something in between? Well, even forget about Rwanda and remote places like that. Between the United States and Mexico, there's a 2-inch difference between the American 9-year-olds are 2 inches taller than the Mexican ones. So does that mean tzitzis in America have to be bigger than tzitzis in Mexico? Maybe. Maybe it's different every country. Look at your 9-year-olds in your country and decide how it should be. Well, to make things even more complicated, there's a Gemara that says that if a beged is an amma by an amma, it's for sure big enough to need tzitzis. It could be small might also. The Gemara is not talking about the shear for tzitzis, but the Gemara says if it's an amma by an amma, it for sure needs tzitzis. Okay, well, how big is an amma? So we know there's always our 3 shittas. Rav Chaim Noah would say it's a little more than 19 inches, Rav Moshe a little more than 21 inches, and the Chazon Ish about 23.6, about 23 and a half inches. Okay, well, excuse me, the very shortest 9-year-olds are the ones from Rwanda, and they were about 46 inches tall. The average for them was about 46 inches tall. Well, Rosh Hashanah of that child, depending, again, if you count the head separate from the rest of the body, is either about 23 inches or about 27 inches, depending on these 2 shittas. Okay, well, that's more than an amma, according to almost every opinion that I told you until now. So how could it be? And if you look at an American or a 9-year-old in America or Eretz Yisrael, he's about 54 inches tall. So his Rosh Hashanah is 27 inches or 36 and a half inches. I'm rounding the numbers a little bit, which is way more than an amma. So how could it be that the Gemara says that a beged, which is an amma by an amma, can cover is enough to be chayiv in tzitzis when it doesn't cover Rosh Hashanah of these 9-year-olds? Okay, so we have these problems. First of all, we don't know, so which 9-year-old should we take? And then second is, doesn't seem to match with what we're seeing, that an amma by an amma should cover that child. Now, the Radvaz had a similar question to what I just asked you, the second question I asked you, that he said, I don't know what his size was. He says, the talis cotton that people use nowadays, I don't know what he had. He said it was way smaller than what cover a 9-year-old. Okay, that was his question. He said, so why are we wearing tzitzis on these things? These talis cottons that we have are not enough to cover a 9-year-old. So his answer was that he holds that Rosh Hashanah of a cotton means of a 5-year-old. It's a question of how old is. The point is, it's a child who's chayiv in tzitzis. I mean, he's chayiv in tzitzis because of chinuch, and the Radvaz says, okay, that means a 5-year-old, as opposed to others are saying that's an older child. So he says it means a 5-year-old. Okay, now 5-year-olds in the Eretz Yisrael in the United States nowadays are about 45 inches tall. So Rosh Hashanah for them is either about 22 and a half inches or about 27 inches. Okay, so that could maybe work. Now I have no idea what size of talis cotton was that the Radvaz was talking about. So maybe for the Radvaz has an answer. Okay, if you hold like the Radvaz that the child has to only be 5-year-old child, then an am by an am is enough to cover Rosh Hashanah for that child. But what do we do with the Mishnah Berurah, and who is really citing others, of course, who say that it's a 9-year-old child? So if it has to be a 9-year-old child, it's got to cover Rosh Hashanah of a 9-year-old child. What does that work? How does that work? So I'm not going to give a great answer to that question, but I'm going to try to answer the question by saying like this. I think we need to rethink in our minds about how we measure these different things. And it starts with a Trumas Hadeshin. Okay? Trumas Hadeshin is like this. He says in the times of the Gemara, the garment that was chayiv in tzitzis was not a shirt or a gown that was covering the whole body like we think of now as a talis cotton, and it covers the whole body. It was a cape. So it was hanging from the person's head and draped down to cover their back. So like Rosh Hashanah was literally, it covered the person's head and then it rolled over their back, literally like a cape. Okay, and that's the one, the Gemara for that is talking about when it says it's an am bain amma, that beged, that's an am bain amma, covers Rosh Hashanah of a child. And I don't have a better answer, but to say that it must have been that the kids in those days were the size as the Rwanda kids, and somehow that fit into being an am bain amma. We'll have to say that. So nowadays, when we have a beged, so in other words, the beged that we need to be enough to cover Rosh Hashanah doesn't have to cover the whole Rosh Hashanah. It has to cover hanging down the back of the person's body, to cover their head and most of the back of their body. And an amma by an amma, the beged that covers that is the beged that's big enough to be chayv in tzitzis. So that was the traditional, what it used to look like in times of the Gemara, and that's what we have to look for when we want to measure the size to decide, is this big enough to be chayv in tzitzis? But nowadays, we don't wear talis kattans as a cape. We wear a talis kattan that covers the front and the back of the body. Okay, it folds over and covers the front and the back. And it's not just the back part that counts. The whole length of that beged, the whole length, the front part and the back part counts towards the shais. So that is to say, we don't need a beged that in the back of the tzitzis would be, the part that goes in the back of your body would cover Rosh Ruba of the back of your body. No, that's not going to work. We need one that in its full length will cover Rosh Ruba. And you could see something like this there's a sefer of someone who actually measured children. And the Artz Chaim brings it, the Artz Chaim is from the Malm, and the way it's quoted in the Artz Chaim is from Sefer Misamche Lev. Okay, but it's a typo, and it shouldn't say Misamche Lev, it should say Mismeche Lev. Okay, instead of a sin, it should be a samach, which is things that were added on from in the Sefer Lev Chaim of Reb Chaim Pelagi. So this is Mismeche, they're samach to Lev, they're close to the heart, not the ones who make your heart happy. Anyhow, in the modern Sefer Lev Chaim, they're printed as footnotes because they were added on. They weren't printed in the back; they're footnotes. Anyhow, so that's what we're quoting here is from this Sefer, which again the Artz Chaim brings as Mesam Chelev. It's a typo. It really should say Mism Chelev. Okay, and the Mishnah Berurah brings it as well. Okay, and he says is that when you make tzitzis, when you make them the beged, how big does it have to be? He says it has to be 3/4 of an amma in front and back. That's what he says it has to be. That has to be 3/4 of an amma in the front and in the back. Now, where did he get that from? Where did 3/4 of an amma come from? The Gemara says that an amma by an amma is for sure good enough. Okay, but where did he come to this 3/4 of an amma in the front and 3/4 of the back? And the answer is because if you have 3/4 in the front and 3/4 in the back, you have a total length of 1.5 ammas, and that is big enough. If you would wear that as a cape instead of wearing it like as a shirt, if you wear it as a cape just to cover the back of your body, that would be big enough to cover Rosh Ruba of the 9-year-old. So how big is it? 1.5 ammas. So according to Ramosha, the sheet of Ramosha, it's almost 32 inches. It's 31 and 8.875 inches, which fits very well with the numbers we have nowadays. Because I told you beforehand, if you took an average 9-year-old in Eretz Yisrael or the United States nowadays, he's about 54 inches tall, which means his Rosh Ruba is either 27.1 inches or 31.6 inches. So if depending on again how you measure Rosh Ruba, with the head or without the head plus the body or separate, so 31.6 inches is exactly what Moshe says was 31.875 inches. Exactly the same thing. So the garment has to be big enough that it would cover the child's head and the back of their body. But in making that cheshbon, when we're counting up how big the garment is, you don't just look at the back, you look at the front and the back together. And so the Mishnah Berurah brings this Mismechelev, this sefer, to say this. And then he says, Anshe Maisa say that the garment should be an am in the front and an am in the back. Okay, so if you just look at this, quickly, you would think that one amma is coming from the Gemara that I mentioned before, and that says that if it's an amma by an amma, then it's for sure chayv in tzitzis. And that is not correct. We know that's not what's going on here, because the Gemara over there was talking about an amma and an amma by an amma just in the back, and he's saying do an amma in the front and an amma in the back also, both, which is double the size. So it's not coming from the Gemara. It's not what he means. So where is it coming from? The answer is that's not coming from a halachic perspective. It's coming up Kabbalah. Okay, the Mishnah Berurah brings it from the Artz Chaim, who says it's the Min Chasidim, and he quotes it from the Siddur of the Baal Tanya, the Siddur and Dach, and from these Kabbalistic manuscripts that he had called Mari Tzedek, and from the Arizal. Okay, so it's al pi Kabbalah. It's not a halachic requirement. Okay, it's al pi Kabbalah. Mishnah Berurah says it's Anshe Ma'aseh do this kind of thing. Okay, so again, so what we've heard so far is a possibility that this year is 3/4 of an amma. We'll at least know what a 3/4 of an amma is. An amma, that's a Gemara, and then 1.5 ammas, which is a way to say it. That way we know that it's big enough to cover, at least nowadays, to cover a 9-year-old. So when we ask this to Rabbi Rizan, as I'm going to go through, I'm going to mention each at the end of each section what Rabbi Rizan said. He said is what we should do is it should be like basically what the Mishnah Berurah says, which was 3/4 an arm in the front, 3/4 an arm in the back, meaning a total of an arm and a half long. As per Rav Moshe, who would hold it was 31.9 inches. So he said, okay, we should go for 32 inches as a round number. That's the length that has to be front and back. Okay, next, let's go to the width. We saw from the Gemara that a beggar is only chayiv in tzitzis if it's big enough to shakatim iskasa b'rosh v'rubai. So that seems to be talking about the length of the how it has to be. But the Shulchan Aruch says no, not just the length; it has to cover the width also. So many poskim assume that means that it has to be an amma wide, based on the Gemara that I mentioned beforehand that says an amma by an amma is enough. But it's not so clear at all that's true. There's a lot of questions on that raya. Just for started, the Gemara didn't say it has to be an amma. The Gemara just says if it is an amma, it's for sure is it's for sure is good enough. Okay, and like just think of it like this. The Gemara says in Yuma that an adult body is an amma wide. So if we only have to cover a 9-year-old, we don't need an amma to cover him because the 9-year-old's width is going to be obviously less than that. Okay, but so there's questions about that, and others talk about. There are other questions about how wide does it have to be? Like, for example, what happens if it's extra long but not as wide? Does it cover the fact that it's extra long, make up for the fact that it's not as wide? And if you say no, it can't. What happens if it's super long and you could just wrap it around the child? You could literally wrap it around like a I don't know what you call it, like just wrap it all around the body, but that cover also. Anyhow, this Chazon Ish is about that. Anyhow, so when we asked Rabbi Reis what he thought, he said is you should just need to be 3/4 of an amma wide, which is basically what the Mishnah Berurah said was 3/4 of an amma wide, and we should go according to Shita Rav Moshe, so that comes out to about 16 inches. 16 inches. So for our length and our width, where we stand now is for our length and our width, we need to have. What did I say? I don't even remember what I said. It needs to be 32 inches long, including front and back, and 16 inches wide. Okay, now we come to a question which a little bit connects to that, but more of its own question, which is about the size of the hole that your neck fits into. Okay, we'll talk later about the holes that the strings go into, but today we're dealing just with the garment itself. Before we get to the size of it, we have to do a drop of background from Hilchos Eruvin. Rishus Yachid, in order to be Rishus Yachid, one of the criteria for being Rishus Yachid is it has to be surrounded by walls. Those walls don't have to be 100% solid by no means, and it's actually possible that most of the wall is empty space. But in din, it's considered to be a solid wall. But sometimes you have solid space, the opposite. Sometimes there's solid space, but there's so much empty space around it that the solid space doesn't count. It becomes disqualified and doesn't count towards it being a wall. Okay, so sometimes empty space counts as if it's solid, and sometimes solid space is looked at as if it's empty and it doesn't count. So one example where solid space does not count is a principle that's called Asi Avir the Haigisu the Haigisu Muvatale. The empty space on the two sides of the solid space, as if they wipe out the solid space that's in between them. Okay, so the Magen Avraham, in his introduction to Hilchos Tzitzis, says that you have to keep this in mind. This rule of Asavir the Haigisu Vatal, you have to keep it in mind when you make a tzitzis, when you make a beggar for tzitzis, and be sure, he said, and therefore make sure that the shoulder straps, the part that connects basically the front to the back, is wide enough. So simply, he means to say, the simple reading is he means like this. Let's say the neck hole is 7 inches wide. Then each strap is only 6 inches wide. Then the strap, the part that holds the front to the back, then those 6 inches of fabric are wiped out by the fact that there's more space on each side of them. Think about it. If the strap on the left side is only 6 inches wide, well, what's on the two sides of that strap? In one side is the hole in the middle, on the neck hole, which is 7 inches wide. The other side, on the outside, is a zillion inches wide. There's nothing there at all. So that would be muvatalit. So the avir, the haigisu muvatalit. That's a simple reading of the Magen Avraham. Is the avir of each side, each strap gets wiped out, gets ignored, or gets erased by basically gets cut out. The halachically doesn't count because of the empty space that's on the sides of it. So that would sound like the Magen Avraham is saying is make sure that the space in between the two straps, the place where your neck goes, is narrower than the solid pieces of the straps that are on the side of it. But some of the later places can say it's hard to believe that that's what the Magen Avraham means, because if you look at some of the rules of us avir the high gisa umvatale is it doesn't fit with what he's saying, because firstly the empty space, one of the empty space, the avir of a high gisa that we're counting is the outside, the space all the way on the outside of the garment. Okay, but that doesn't count when you say us avir the high gisa. Things that are not part of the whole situation don't count at all. Next is the principle of avir the high gisa only applies to wool, not to fabric and other kalim. Okay, so there's questions on whether it's really people question whether the Magen Avraham, that's what he really means. Okay, that he really means that the straps have to be wider than the space where the neck goes. Mishnah Berurah says no. They say what he means is what the Machzor Shekel says that the Magen Avraham means. Not what I just said was the simple reading. No, it doesn't mean that. He means is the Magen Avraham didn't mean the traditional, the real Hilchas Eruvin Avir the Hagisa. And he didn't mean that there's a specific shear for how big the straps have to be on the side, the parts that hold the front to the back. That's not what the Magen Avraham was talking about. What he's saying was is that make sure that the straps are wide enough that they should be part of the garment and not just looked at as just like fasteners holding it on. If you see pictures from a million years ago of what tzitzis looked like, literally it was two pieces of fabric with a something like a thin string holding them together. That little piece, it was obvious when you looked at it that the two parts of the front of the bag and the back of the bag had nothing to do with each other. This is just a connector. He was using the word avir the haigisa, which is just a borrowed terminology from Hilchas Eruvin. It didn't mean the technicalities of it. It didn't mean it has to be literally wide enough to be bigger than the hole in the space. That's not what he's talking about. All he meant is that make sure the straps have some meaningful width to them, and not just be this thin little nothing that's in between them. Okay. Now that when I'm saying this is the way Machzor Shekel says. This is where many of the poskim understand what the Magen Avraham is saying. I just mentioned that the Magen Avraham himself is quoting a Maril, the way he saw it in the Sefer Mata Moshe, and who's bringing Sefer Ogor. Okay, and all those people have the same words of what the Maril said, which is fine. And you could read what the Machzor Shekel said into all that. All that works beautifully. The only thing is that in more recent years, the Maril, the Maril Chadashas was printed, and if you looked, and it was not available to any of these poskim beforehand, or at least to many of them. And if you look at what the actual Maril says, it sure sounds like over there that he does not mean to borrow terminology. He's mamish talking about the dinim as in Hilchas Eruvin, like the simpler way to read it, and not like the way we're saying it now. But in the Lysis, the later poskim don't accept that, and they say the Magen Avraham means it, and whether the Maril meant it, it's not, we don't know, but the Magen Avraham doesn't mean it, and it's just a way of talking, but it's not with the technicalities of the rule. Now, Chazon Ish says, I agree with that, but I have a different reason from the Avir Haigisa angle of things, but I have a different reason why the shoulder straps have to be wider than the neck hole. Okay, that's what our question is. How wide do they have to be? He says it's because there's another rule, which is very similar to one of Avir Haigisa, and that is, it's called Aymin Rubal Aparatz, which says is that when you have a wall with spaces and solid, the solid spaces have to be bigger than the empty spaces, and therefore the walls, the straps have to be bigger than the empty space where your neck goes, because or else it's paratz muval oimid, in which case the oimid, the solid part, doesn't count. And he says also there's a machlokes rishonim by oimid muval paratz. Okay, again, which means is that you have to have more solid space than empty space. What happens if you have two solid spaces and one empty space in between them? Just like our situation, we have two solid spaces. That's the two straps of the beged, and the empty space in between where your neck goes. Okay, which one do we count? Do we count the two together? When we say it has to be merubal apart, do we add the two together? The two solid spaces together, they have to be more than the parts? Or is it one on each face? For example, there was 6 inches of solid space on each side, and there's 7 inches of empty space in the middle. Is that merubal apart because we have 12 inches in total of solid space? or do you say no? It's paris merula oimed because we have more 7 inches is more than 6 inches, more than each of the sides. Okay, there's a question called oimed meruba mishnei tzdadim. So in Hilchos Eruvin, the Mishnah Berurah is makel and says it's okay if you have oimed meruba on between the two sides together. So what in my situation, 6 and 6 is 12 is more than the 7 space in the middle. Okay, that's the Mishnah Berurah says in Hilchos Eruvin. Chazon says that's really nice in Hilchos Eruvin because Eruvin is a shayla of the Rabbanan. But here we're talking about a shayla with the Deraisa of Tzitzis in general. Whether Tzitzis is a Deraisa, even though my technicalities maybe it's not a Deraisa, but overall Tzitzis is a Deraisa, and also in carrying outside. If you're wearing a beged that's not chayv tzitzis, then the strings is considered hoitzah, which could potentially deraisa. So Chazon says for deraises, we should be machmir and say you need to have each side's solid space has to be bigger than the empty space in the middle, or else it's not considered not omer merubah apart. So that's what the Chazon says, and therefore he says is you have to have each of the straps on each side has to be bigger than the hole that's in between where your neck goes. So the question on this is that I'm not going to argue on the Eruvin part of it or the merubah apart parts of it. I'm going to just indirectly, which is everyone who says don't take the Magen Avraham literally. The Magen Avraham doesn't mean what he says. He just meant they don't have a thin strap. Well, the Chazon is basically coming to the same conclusion as the Magen Avraham did. So how come everyone who's saying the Magen Avraham didn't really mean it because I've heard the Hagisa doesn't work, doesn't apply here, blah blah blah. They have all kinds of things to say what the Magen Avraham says, but shouldn't be taken literally. Why don't they all say, but you're mechuyev to do it anyhow because of this merubah parts thing? So what's going on here? It's like, well, Chazon is basically coming to the same conclusion as what we would have thought originally was what the Magen Avraham said. So why doesn't everybody say that when they talk about this Magen Avraham? A little strange. Another question is, but that's the Chazon says each side does have to be wider than in the middle. But then there's another question. The Mishnah Berurah says when you want to measure to decide if a beged is big enough is long enough to be chayv in tzitzis. So I remember I told you it has to be 32 inches. We came out 32 inches long. So what happens if the fabric is 35 inches long in total? Okay, the length front and back together is a full length. If you lay it down on the table, it's 35 inches long. But the hole, the neck hole, has a length. Okay, not width, a length. Before we were talking about the width of the neck hole. Now we're talking about it has a length hole with 7 inches long. So the Mishnah Berurah says for this, the garment is only considered 28 inches. And the reason is because there's only 28 inches of fabric. The whole thing, if you lay it down end to end, is 35 inches. But there's a big space in the middle where your head goes, which is 7 inches long. So you really don't have 35 inches, you only have 28 inches, that means it's not big enough to count because we said you have to be 32 inches to be long enough. So Chazon says, no, I don't agree with that. He says there are rules about when empty spaces get considered to be filled up, as if they're filled up. He says, and one of the rules is, I'm in merubah aparetz. If it's I'm in merubah aparetz, then if there's more solid space than empty space, the empty space is like it's filled in. So in this case, we have 28 inches of solid space, 7 inches of empty space. I'm in merubah aparetz as if the 7 inches is filled up. It happens physically, it's empty. That's where your head goes. But in din, he says it's considered to be full. So it's considered to be full. So it's as if the whole thing is 35 inches long. Okay. So he says it's got to be that it's got to be. So let me just finish before I get back to his right. He says, and therefore he says is as long as the shoulder straps are wider than this hole in the middle, wider than the hole in the middle between them, the hole in the middle counts as if the whole thing is solid, widthwise and lengthwise. It all counts as if it's solid. Now, the Chazon Ish, just back to the Chazon Ish for a second. He says it's got to be we have the rule of merubah parts for this, is because he says otherwise. What are we going to say? We're going to say every tiny hole in the beged doesn't count. I mean, think about it. A piece of fabric has holes in it, and a little tiny hole. All of a sudden, that part doesn't count. So how are we ever going to get a beged that's direct, like length and width? Okay, that's what he says. So right, obviously we follow the rules of merubah parts and things like that. So the answer to his raya is that the need for length and width is because of ksus chashet chasabai. So it has to be a garment that you cover yourself with. Well, obviously, a garment that you cover yourself has holes in it. That's obvious. It's so built into what they didn't require in the first place. So that's all for typical holes. When we have an unusual hole, like the big hole for your head, maybe that wouldn't count. Anyhow, back to what we're going over here. So, the Chazon Ish said that the neck hole has got to be less wide than each of the individual straps. And the Chazon Ish said also that once we did that, once we accomplished that, then the then we say Oimru Paritz, and the garment is complete, and you count the full length, even the whole of it. Now, a little question on the Chazon Ish is that Chazon Ish is telling you make sure that we have Oimru Paritz, but make sure the straps on the sides are each wider than the hole. Each strap is wider than the hole, than the width of the hole in the middle. Now, I'm not really sure why you say that. Why don't you say Oimru Paritz? Look at the length, like you just said before, and it was 35 inches long. It's got a 7-inch hole in the middle. The two sides are each way bigger than the hole. Why isn't that Oimru Paritz? I'm not really sure why you don't say that way. Why you only look at it sideways instead of forwards? There's a Chazon Ish about it. I'm not going to pretend there isn't, but I'm not sure what he says. Anyhow, he says is that if you cut it off widthwise, then there's literally no connection between the front and the back. So we'll look at it separately. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Anyhow, so it could be that when the Mishnah Berurah will agree that when the Mishnah Berurah said beforehand that the hole doesn't count because the hole doesn't count towards the length of the garment because the hole is that it's just there's no fabric there. That maybe goes together with what the Mishnah Berurah said, that the straps on the side don't have to be wider than the hole in the middle. In which case, then this is just like a bit empty space. But it could be that if the Mishnah Berurah would, in the cases where the width is wider than the hole in the middle, then maybe he would agree to the Chazon Ish because Lamaisa there's relatively small space of the hole, and we consider as if it's closed up. So, as if we had a situation, maybe the Mishnah Berurah was talking about his kind of situation where the strap was pretty narrow. It was narrower than the width of the hole, so therefore the whole middle doesn't count. And then he says that we don't count that towards the length of the garment. But it could be if in the situation was where the straps were actually wider, he would agree, and which is very lamaisa because in most cases, just about all cases that I saw, if I remember, at least in regular tzitzis, the width of the strap is wider than the space where your head goes in. And in fact, it is wider. And it is wider, in which case, if we're right, then the Mishnah will agree that in that case, the length should count. And this shaila of whether the whole counts towards length is actually very relevant for V-neck tzitzis. Okay? Because in a V-neck tzitzis, the hole is relatively long. And it could be that if we don't count that whole length towards the tzitzis, there may be situations where you'll end up where that the tzitzis will not be long enough. The front and the back by themselves, without the length of the hole, will not give us our 32 inches. I don't know how common it is, but it's possible that it could be. So we'd have to think that through. This shaila of counting the hole comes up relevant to a V-neck tzitzis, that they maybe are not going to be long enough. They won't be long enough to be chayv tzitzis of that. Okay, so now two questions just from Rabbi Reis. So Rabbi Reis said that we should be makbid that the fabric on each side fabric, the strip of fabric should be wider than the hole in the center. That's one thing. And he did say is also that when we measure the length of the garment, the part where the hole is, where the neck goes, does count towards the length. Okay, I don't remember if he said that was because of the Chazon Ish, or he held that the Mishnah would agree if we did with the last thing, which is wide enough. But that's what he said, is we would count that hole towards the length, the full length of the garment. Okay, so that's what we had to say today about the length, width, and neck hole of the garment. Next time we'll talk about some more things having to do with the garment itself before we move on to other stuff.